it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here for another PB&J card class. And today I have another video for you showing a no-line watercoloring technique featuring our gorgeous new cling stamp rose bowl. This is from our Nature's Art collection. And I will also be combining this with a sentiment from our transparent set Choose Happy, as well as the Penny Black Creative Die Set Stitch Stackers. I'll be using that to make a frame. And real quick here, I'm just popping up a full list of all the supplies used in creating this card, and I will put this back up on screen at the very end of the video. So if you'd like to check out anything in more detail, including the colors I'm using, the exact stamps and dies, product numbers, that will be right back up on screen at the end of the video, and you can just hit pause to check it out in more detail. So to begin, I did pre-stamp my image onto Canson 140-pound cold press watercolor paper using antique linen distress ink, and I did do this in the Misty stamp positioning tool so I could just do multiple impressions and get a nice look even on the little bit of texture that watercolor paper has. Now I am coloring this using Faber-Castell Design Memory Craft Art Grip Aquarelle watercolor pencils, and I am putting the color down into the areas of the rose that are would sort of be sinking down into the bottom of the flower. And if you're not sure, by looking at the packaging that helps, or just alternate it. So just stick it down where it's next to a white part so you can create some dimension. Then I'm going in now with just a paintbrush and water and starting in the open white area and then blending down into the area that I colored. And this just gives a nice soft look, but because you start by putting the water in the open area and move down into the area that you've colored, then that allows that to sort of blend up into the open area. If you find it's all blending together, just work around the image in sections so that you don't put too much water on petals that are right next to each other before they have time to dry. I'm moving on now to the leaves, so just coloring in with a green watercolor pencil. Most of that darker color is sort of towards the bottom of the leaf where it would attach to the branch or the stem. Then I go back and blend that by putting my water down in the open area, the white area, and blending down into the area that I've colored, allowing that water to sort of wick away and have the rest of that blend out. Now once these particular watercolor pencils are dry, they are permanent, so you can go back in and add more layers and blending without re-blending the area that you've already colored. So I'm going back in now, just adding a little bit of yellow to the rose, not all over, but just in a few spots. And I love adding just a touch of yellow to any of my flowers that are pink or red. I just think it brightens them up, and to me yellow is just a really cheerful color. Now I'm also going to take a pretty sharp same watercolor pencil, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading with that down in just some of the areas where a petal is sort of folded over, and this just gives a more detailed look to the design. So if you want more of a loose, light, flowy look, you could skip this step, but if you want to add more detail into the stamp, a little bit more dimension, you can do that. And here I'm just grabbing this to do the same thing here with a little bit of darker green. And I put that down and then put that lighter green back on top. And I'll go back in and blend that out with just a little bit of water. And then while I have that paintbrush out, I'll also just do a little bit of blending here on this rose. So some of the areas where I put that paint, I will just very lightly add a touch of water to blend it, where I put that colored pencil. But you can also just leave it and not blend it out with water. There's so many different ways to do this. There's no wrong way. I just continued with that process for the other rose and the rest of the leaves. And here I will just add a little bit of coloring and shading to the rose bowl itself. I'm doing that with a light blue, putting down the color where I want it to be the darkest. And just kind of churning my image as I work helps me get the right angle for my hand and the watercolor pencil. And then I'll go back in and blend that. So putting down that water and then kind of working my way into the area that I colored and blending it out that way. Now I'm also going to color onto a piece of scratch watercolor paper and pick that up with a wet paintbrush and just drop some of that down into the onto the paper. This just darkens up the color. It adds another layer, another dimension. And I did leave some areas of white highlight down on the glass. So I didn't get too technical with my shading on the glass, but just by leaving some areas of white, it will give that a more reflective look of glass. I'm using the same process to add a little additional color here on my leaves. I love to add just a touch of this turquoise green. So the leaves are dry and I am just picking that up with a wet paintbrush and painting it in, adding a little more water to blend it out. This adds so much more dimension and shading to those leaves, as you can see there. And just fiddling around, adding a little bit more down here onto the rose bowl. And I'm just using a very sharp brown pencil here to just draw in a few of the details that I want to be darker. Now to sort of ground this image, I am coloring onto that scratch paper with the brown, picking it up with a wet paintbrush and then painting it on. While it's still wet, I'll get some more water onto my paintbrush and blend that out. I chose to do this on the scratch paper first because I didn't want it to be too dark. So that allows me to dilute that color before applying it to the paper. So that's just something else you can do with your watercolor pencils. Now once it's dry, I'm going to go ahead and stamp my sentiment. I'm using Ranger Archival ink in the color of potting soil. I have laid out my frame onto the panel. It's not glued down yet, but I'm just holding it there with the magnets just for placement of my sentiment. And this is watercolor paper again, so it does have a bit of texture, so it's helpful to stamp it in a stamp positioning tool. So you can do a couple of impressions and get full coverage. It also helps darken up the color with that ink pad. But if you just have an acrylic block, that also works just fine too. Now I did decide to add just a little bit more shading onto this image, and I've grabbed just the very dark brown, and it is amazing if you add just a touch of that in a few places. You do not need to go overboard with this, but just here and there where the darkest areas would be, it will really add so much depth to the flowers and especially to those leaves. Any place that they would be behind a flower or a petal would be behind another petal or really deep down into the center of the rose. Just a little bit of that dark brown goes a long ways. So I'm just adding a touch of that on here, and you can really see as you add those shadows in with just very small lines what a difference that makes on those flowers. Now to finish things off, I'm going to use the same colors I used to paint the roses, and I'm coloring them onto a scratch sheet of paper, and I'm just going to take a wet paintbrush and pick those up and splatter the background. I didn't want it to go over the vase or that sentiment, so I just put another piece of scratch paper down, and I am just adding water and hitting my paintbrush onto my finger to add some very light splatters in those same colors as the flowers. And I'll dry that with the heat gun. I have my frame that I cut with the stitch stacker set, and I'm going to put that right on top of the card. I love this in the same tone-on-tone look, so I did cut that from watercolor paper and use dimensional foam squares behind it. And then to finish this off, all I did was add it to a note card, and it was ready to go. Now using the same technique, I've done a few other cards, and I'll give you a look at those here. If you didn't catch my previous videos, these will be new for you. This is a look at the collection. On this first card, I used the stamp Summer Glow and painted it using that same process and watercolor papers, although I did do some background painting by coloring with the yellow onto a scratch paper palette and painting it on. This is some painting with a Sing Song stamp. And then finally, I also used the ebullient stamp to create a border of flowers. And I have a video for this card, so if you've missed it, I'll be sure to link that for you down in the YouTube description box below. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And here's a look at all the supplies used in creating this card. Happy stamping!